Everyone, especially given the extreme amount of Zoom fatigue that we're all feeling by April. There's light. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you for joining. This is going to be a really interesting discussion today, and thanks in advance, Bill, for moderating. Thank you so much, Anita, for making the time to share your fascinating research with us. A quick reminder that remember this Wednesday we have that special roundtable discussion on teaching the workshops, history and methods, featuring a number of kind of keystone workshoppers, along with our current crop of wonderful Ostrom fellows, talking about some of their work on their service learning project over the course of this last academic year. So that's going to be really, really exciting. I hope you can all join in. And remember, it's a little longer than normal, so we're booking out the full 90 minutes. So feel free, of course, to hop on and hop off as well as needed. So that's going to be lovely. And then we'll also have another special announcement looking ahead to our last colloque coming up on April 26th, but we'll just keep that as kind of as a teaser for the time being. So thank you so much again, Anita, for joining us. And Bill, I think you are moderating, good sir. So over to you. And thank you for
doing it. And happy to do so. Thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody. We're really pleased to have Professor Anita Chaudhry as our colloquium presenter today. Dr. Chaudhry is Professor of Economics at California State University, Chico, and also a faculty associate in the Center for Water and the Environment there. She completed her PhD at the University of Wyoming after receiving master's degrees from both USC and the University of Connecticut. She also spent a year as a researcher at the International Water Management Institute. She researches how institutions governing people's access to and control of water contribute to economic outcomes, good or bad, and then the potential of various solutions when those outcomes are undesirable. Her work has appeared in journals Land Economics, World Development, Agricultural Economics, Water Resources and Economics, among others. And today she shares with us some current work on the performance of water markets in California. So please join me in welcoming Professor Anita Chaudhry. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. We're very excited about this work. And I hope Dean joins us, my co-author, and answers all the questions as Bill said. So I'm happy to stay back after the hour block for any questions, or of course by email as well. So I'm going to share screen to my presentation and put this in presentation mode. Feel free to interrupt me if there is a clarification question, but of course I'm happy to discuss anything in detail afterwards. All right, so is California's water market supply constrained? This is joint work with a professor of geography and planning, Dean Fairbanks, my colleague and partner in a lot of research projects that we do together. And as you will see, I hope pretty soon in the next few minutes is this has been a labor of love for both of us, trying to understand some of the water allocation and governance issues in California in a slightly different way than has been done in economics before, for sure. So a bit of a background, climate change, population pressures are continuing to increase. Competition over limited water supplies. Just 2 weeks ago, the state of California announced that this year, 2021, is also likely to be a very dry year. And there is research that recently came out that rains are becoming, rain events that pull California or pull the West out of droughts are becoming more erratic. So there is a longer term climate effects at work as well. So most senior water rights rest with farmers in the Western US as a whole, definitely in California. I'm not going to go into the detail of water right allocations. There's lots of really good research on that. Now, and I'm going to go get straight into the whole issue of water markets. Now, water markets have been facilitated for the last 3 decades in California, for sure. to improve allocations of existing water supplies away from farmers who hold most of the senior water rights, and mitigate just overall losses that the economy and the environment faces from drought. But a persistent conundrum in water economics or water markets literature in general, or water policy literature in general, has been, if water markets are so awesome, why is it that the volume traded in the markets is so low, right? Just the recent numbers that have come out, the average annual supply is 64 million acre feet, and it's just 2% of that supply that gets traded in the market. There are other smoking guns pointing out to that the volume is very low and it should be more, because the price of water traded in different places in California seems really far apart. So there should be opportunities for arbitrage. But those opportunities, do they even exist? Are people not selling? Are there huge transactions costs, right? That's where your mind goes immediately. But whatever it is, right, that's been a bit of a puzzle. Why is it so low, right? And that's going to be, that was something that kind of definitely piqued my curiosity on this issue. So a little bit of a step back from this paper, just to broadly introduce this research overall. We focus on irrigation districts. Now, irrigation or water districts, I think, are somewhat hidden in plain sight. I think they're not, they work independently from city governments, county governments. They are independent specialized districts. They provide focused service. So irrigation or water districts are often giving specialized and focused service on irrigation related operations. 68%, last estimates I've seen, 68% of all irrigation water is managed by irrigation districts in California. These are mostly surface water related districts. And I think the economics literature definitely has overlooked the role these districts have played in managing water supplies, and especially when it comes to water markets. So some of the questions broadly we're asking in this research is, how does variation in district governance affects market participation? Because these district governance rules are really different. How do overlapping jurisdictions, county governments, city government, how does that affect water market participation? And it comes into play in a big way when it comes to groundwater, right? That's all I'll say about it just yet, but there's a lot more about overlapping jurisdictions, and with the Groundwater Management Act coming through, there's going to be even more of that. So some of the challenges that this research approach faces is data issues. Data on water market transactions is simply not publicly available. It's often proprietary data. And land and water use data at the district level is also not available. USDA stopped collecting it in 1978. Just last year, they started again doing that census of irrigation organizations, but that data is not available. So I hope with more data being available, this research that I'm going to show today can be scaled up, because we're doing a case study of 3 districts here. And I think the insights are much more powerful when you look at the water market behavior at the district level. So our approach is overall in this research is to compile these data. It's a labor of love. It takes a long time, but it's extremely insightful, I think. And you will see Dean's fingerprints here. We often use satellite data, which is becoming increasingly of better quality, and it's becoming more higher resolution, not just in terms of space, but also in terms of time. So it's more available, and you can put a lot of data together on land use, and you can back out water use from that. So in this paper, like again, going back to the main question, what are the bottlenecks on the supply side, if there are any? We develop a case study of 3 neighboring districts in California's northern Central Valley, also called the Sacramento Valley, which is where I'm physically located. The case study spans the entire time period of water markets in California, starting from the first drought water bank in 1991, which was the first big experiment in getting districts to sell some of their water allocations to interested buyers outside of the districts, often in the southern part of California, David, where you're from, which is a more drier part of the state. And 1991 was a bit of a, like it was a big bang moment for water markets. So these 3 irrigation districts, they're about 100,000 irrigated acres. Sacramento Valley as a whole is about 2 million acre feet. So can I give you some perspective? We are using a Landsat, a 30-meter resolution. Dean can talk more about it if you're interested, if he's here, if he's joined us. So we compile water transfer data, and you did that basically through newspaper sources, government documents, even just calling up the district managers and just having informal conversations with them. So, and then we triangulated these sources for each of these 29 years. That's how we did it. And then what you're going to see now is us examining and the results of what that analysis shows. Give you a spatial perspective here. This is Sacramento Valley up here. A lot wetter part of the state in terms of precipitation, source area for water for the rest of California. But again, as I was telling you earlier, these patterns are shifting. You're moving more towards dry periods. The buyers of water from Sacramento Valley in water markets are typically in San Joaquin Valley. So this is the delta right here. And those water trades or transfers, as I'm going to call them, often cross over the delta and come here. I can speak more about who the buyers are if you're interested later. Again, so who are these districts? They are very senior surface water right holders. Seniority basically means their water supply is uncorrelated with water supply of the rest of California, right? They get their allocations even in a dry year most of the time. They mostly grow rice. Rice is an annual crop, right? If you don't plant it this year, you don't have to irrigate, which basically mean that they have been transferring water or selling water. There are lots of words used. There are lots of verbs used for that. I'm just going to use the word transfer. That's the word that has been commonly used, even though they're selling their water allocation or leasing their water allocation. So how do they do that? They just don't grow that year. They don't plant the rice crop, right? Which happens in early March. No, I think it's later in March. But it's typically a 1-year sale. They lease. So what did we find with that data triangulation? In the 29 years we are studying, there were 13 extremely dry years, and the sample districts transferred water in 11 years. And what I want to focus on is what we discovered as we kept working, that there are some really policy-induced water transfer restrictions in place. And these restrictions tend to be very, very binding. Like if these restrictions are relaxed, evidence to me seems that water transfers are going to really increase, especially in the kind of a dry year we're going in right now. So the 2 restrictions that are really important is one, the 20% cap on area fallowed for water transfer. And the second one is a groundwater substitution restriction. So let's talk about them a little bit more in depth. So the 20% cap on area fallowed for transfer, this is a statewide California water code. And it was put in place, if you look at the date, right around the time, right after the first big bang moment for water markets. So in the first drought water bank, districts were fallowing 40, 50% of their area and selling that water. And that was extremely unpopular in areas of origin. So in 1992, the state law came, okay, if you want a fallow to sell, no more than 20%, right? Now, where did that 20% came from? It really was, to the best of my knowledge, from all the conversations and the research I've done, was a rule of thumb. All right, 20%. Somehow we'll just pull a number out of a hat. But the more you think about it, it's kind of interesting because there are some local areas where there could be a lot of irrigation districts clustered together. And 20% of each of those is going to be a lot more of that economy and that groundwater basin than an area where there's just one irrigation district. So this 20% is at the district level. It is not sensitive to the kind of crop being planted because different crops can tend to have different forward and backward linkages in the economy. It's just a rule of thumb that applies across the board, right? And it's not a forbidding, it's not that you cannot do more than 20%. No, you can, but you have to ask for permission. You have to ask for a local hearing. Nobody ever does that. Nobody's asked to fallow more than 20%. So there's just, because it leads to a lot of delays and controversy, nobody wants to do it. So it's effectively been a deterrent, right? And the goal really was, it was to limit the loss of economic activity in the water sale regions, right? But if you apply basic Econ 101, when you have a cap on a volume that you can sell, what does that do to the market? Especially if that cap does not satisfy the demand, which it often does not. That cap is going to put the pressure on price. Price of water is going to go up, right? And if price of water is going to get escalated in a serious drought, who is benefiting at whose expense, right? Some of the lower buyers who cannot afford that price are going to drop out, right? That's what a supply demand model tells us, right? And the farmers who are getting to sell that, those abundant supplies that they might have, are really going to profit from that trade opportunities. So one needs to think a little bit more carefully about what this cap is doing about distributing the costs and benefits of water markets. The second restriction that I think is super interesting in the study area that we're looking at came about in 1996. This was a restriction that was advocated for by groundwater users in the areas of origin, that if a district is selling the water, fine, I guess they can do it, it's their surface water allocation, they cannot pump groundwater to continue growing rice in this case. If they want to do it, they have to ask for permission, right? Just like the 20% cap. Again, delays, controversy, nobody's asked for it, right? So this is an interesting restriction as well. Obviously, it's meant to protect groundwater users from the decision of surface water users in the districts. From an economics point of view, I think this is interesting because it has shifted the burden of externalities from groundwater users to agricultural service providers, right? Because now the only transfer that can happen without asking for permission is a fallow-based transfer. And fallow means less economic activity. You have a 20% cap that is happening, that is still in place, but now a transfer would mean less economic activity. Groundwater cannot be used unless you ask for permission, but nobody does. So it's really been a fallow-based transfer since 1996. All right, so let me show you some of the data that we've put together with these two restrictions at the back of your mind. This first figure, I think I call it figure 2 in the paper, is 3 lines you see, right? The red line is the water supply to the sample districts from 1991 to 2019. And the vertical axis, the y-axis is showing you the percentage of total contract amount that they received, right? So it's their water supply. So what do you see in the red line? It's always 100% except for 3 years, right? 1991, 1992, their allocation was cut to 50%, and then in 2015, right? So these guys, this is a reflection of how senior they are, how senior water rights they have, right? Rest of California is down here in the blue lines. The Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. This was a really bad drought right here from 2012. Actually 2012 to 2015. You can see the allocations are so much below 100%. But these districts, they were fine. They were receiving their allocations, which they turned around and sold. Right? These orange dots here tell you the sale year. So they sold in 8, 9, 10, 12. 14, and then most recently in 18. Right, their allocation was cut in 2015. It was such a bad drought that after a few years of drought, finally their allocation got cut as well. They did not sell that year in 2015. And actually, I was just looking up what their decision is going to be in 2021, this year, which is the drought year. And it seems pretty clear that if their allocation gets cut, which is what they're expecting, they will not sell. Right? So to the extent that the supplies are uncorrelated, which is one of the results in this in the paper, these short-term water transfers work great. But in a longer, more severe drought, they prefer to grow rice. Right? And if the allocation is cut, they can make up with groundwater pumping. Right? They don't have to fallow. It's the groundwater substitution restriction is only affects their sale decision, but it doesn't let them pump and sell. Right? The other graph that I wanna that we put together, this is the data from satellite land use data. This is the annual percentage. So the blue lines are the 3 districts we are studying, and the vertical axis is the percentage of district area fallowed, right? So what do we see here, right? The early drought water bank years and the shaded bars in the background, the shadows are the droughts. So in the early drought period, 91, 92, you see that huge percentage fallowed. And then since then, it has really stayed below 20%. There's a little bit of a peak, a nudge above 20%, but this 20% seems to be really binding, right? They're not going over that. In 2018, one of the districts crept a little bit above, which I thought was very interesting. And in 2014 as well, like a little bit above, right? 15, they pumped, even though their allocation got cut, they pumped and they grew rice. They had a full coverage. Right, so I think just examining this picture kind of gave us a lot of further questions or further hypotheses. They're not, so 20% seems to be really, really binding. Another interesting thing was the groundwater substitution restriction has not discouraged sales. It's just made all sales fallow based. Right, so it's like I was saying earlier, it's shifted the externality or the negative effects of a transfer from ag users, from groundwater users to ag users, right? So it's a bit of a shift, right? Okay. I can come back to this as the discussion goes.
Thanks. Anita, hi, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to do 2 things. One, ask you maybe to conclude in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then second, this is the signal I want to share with everybody else that if you have questions for Anita, you can either raise your hand in the participant list or just type into the chat, I have a question, and then I'll just keep a queue of questions. So sorry for the interruption, Anita, but I just wanted to give people a heads up on how to ask questions when you conclude. Thanks.
No, thank you for that. I was actually looking for a clock because I was wondering how I was doing on time. Yeah, so I'm about to wrap up. Just one little comment that I'll make on this figure before I just move towards wrapping up is, now I forgot what I was going to say. It'll come back to me. All right. Oh, yes. So this is the data from government documents and newspaper sources on, is our hypothesis that the 20% cap is increasing the price of water. it seems like there is a pressure on price. The closer they get to 90 to 20%, the higher the price they negotiate. So I think the question that is screaming at me when I look at this is, how is this cap distributing the benefits of water markets in the rural community, right? Because both restrictions are framed to restrict the costs of transfers, even though they're rules of thumb and they're just pulled out of a hat. But we haven't really talked about how communities can share the benefits from transfers, right? And these are some tremendous benefits. I mean, the benefits of growing rice don't match the benefits from selling the water allocation. So just some quick results. Given policy-induced restrictions, sample districts are maximizing volume and frequency of water sales. Is California's water market supply restricted? Yes, very much so, because of these policy-induced restrictions. In spite of that, districts tend to be highly responsive to high water demand in water buying areas. And short-term transfers, I think, may be limited instruments for mitigation of the effects of severe droughts. Some questions that we are mulling over, hopefully kind of seed some ideas here. These restrictions do need more scrutiny. Definitely their distributional aspects. They give you no incentive to increase irrigation efficiency or crop adjustments. In fact, they might actually be creating a perverse incentive to just sit on the resource and sell it when you have an opportunity. The 20% cap exacerbates the increase in price in water prices, right? Maybe there should be policies to consider sharing of the rents from these transfers. Need to think carefully about how sensitive the local economy and the groundwater basins are to the 20% cap. I can think of basins where the 20% cap is too generous, and in other basins it could be too restrictive, depending on the sustainability goal. Could we think of a water transfer model where the source region community shares the benefits from transfers rather than just protection from costs of transfers? And finally, as a last thought, the case study was only 3 districts. And based on our research in other projects, it seems like only 25% of potential districts that could transfer water in Sac Valley are doing so. So what's holding the others back? Because rice is about a quarter of the ag area in the Sac Valley. So what's holding this back? So I think the district level research is super interesting. And I think it can yield some interesting insights on water markets or water policy in general. And that concludes my presentation, I believe. Yes. And I'm going to stop share, I think, unless somebody has a specific question on a slide, which I can bring back later, but let me stop share.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. Very clear slides. Appreciate it. I have a question, and it may also be beneficial for other folks who aren't as familiar with how this works. And that is about the unit of analysis here. So many people, when thinking about water markets, would think about sellers as being farmers.
Yes.
And it seems as though in your paper, if I followed it correctly, you're talking about districts as sellers and not farmers as sellers. And so first, I just wanted to make sure that I was sort of raising that as a point of clarification, and then I'll ask this sort of question associated with it. It seemed in a footnote that you were indicating that there are intra-district transfers among farmers, but not these sort of outside of district transfers. So farmers participate actively in transfers with other farmers within the same irrigation district. Is that accurate? But the market is constrained in moving water out of an irrigation district.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for both of those questions. I'll address the second one first. So within a district, um, farmers or landowners, I should say, very frequently engage in adjustments of their allocations. That's not the goal of this paper. That's not the goal of water markets, right? Because the goal of water markets or the whole reallocation policies are to allocate water more towards urban uses, it used to be, or more towards environmental or in-stream value uses, to take it out of agriculture, right? Intra-district transfers are super easy because the infrastructure is there, they all know each other, right? So it's just a phone call, like divert the canal flow here or over there. So it's not of interest to me in this paper. In fact, they happen so often that I don't even think, I mean, I think the district might keep track of it because they need to charge a bill at the end of the year. So no, that's not what this paper is about. Your second question was a unit of analysis. Okay, this is a really great question. So this is how these 3 districts, and I believe it is fairly common across other districts who transfer. The district management is typically going to negotiate, or it's going to field offers from, increasingly now the buyers are also organizing themselves in buyers groups. They're going to field offers from buyers groups. And then if the district management, the board of directors is okay with this, and if they think a good offer is coming, they open up a sign up for who wants to sell, because it's 20%. Not everybody's going to get to sell. And then based on everybody's rental, everybody's lease agreements with their shareholders or their own production plans, right? They get to sign up. So it is a tiered decision. The district management chooses it. Then the landowners sign up. And if I could complicate the conversation a little bit more, there are sometimes environmental considerations about contiguity of habitat. There's a snake that is threatened. It needs this much contiguous habitat. So the fallowed rice fields cannot be close together more than this much area. So then the district management needs to say, all right, Bill, you can sign up, but Brian, no, you cannot because you're right next to Bill. So that's going to make the fallow area a lot big. We're going to run out of, we're going to create a habitat issue.
Yeah.
So yes, so I think within district enrollment of sale acres is also a pretty complicated process. Yeah.
Thank you. And again, just a reminder to folks, you can either use the raise hand function or type in the chat that you have a question, and I'm happy to recognize you. Either way, Brian is up next.
Okay, good. Lots of neat things going on. Could ask lots of questions. We'll try and focus on one, particularly related to, you keep saying nobody asks to go over the 20%. So to me, that seems what would be fascinating to explore, what's the opportunity, the potential, including transaction costs and everything else. And just to point out, like part of what you're just saying, again, within districts, people have figured out how to move water around. You just talked about they've worked out actually some of the environmental regulations, which are a whole additional layer of regulation. You also talk in terms of, in the footnote, it's clear you can only transfer the water, the real water savings in reducing evapotranspiration. They worked out the accounting, water accounting on that. They've worked out the infrastructure to the point that they told the state, okay, you move the water, but we want to make the deals. So they've figured out a lot of things related to water transfers. So the question is, on the positive side, what would it take? Are there any places where people have at least attempted to put together, a proposal to go over the 20%, or, considered holding hearings or whatever? Because that would seem to be the kind of, the margin, the institutional opportunity.
I think it's going to be SIGMA. So SIGMA is Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that comes into effect this year, This has been the big conversation for the last 5 years. I think, yes, I think it has to go there. I think that's the elephant in the room now. And if you think about it, these two restrictions came into place once the door to water markets opened. So both of them kind of came in place. Once the fallow was as big as 40%, 20% restriction came. Then the groundwater substitution happened, and then the groundwater substitution restriction came. So the policy dynamic, the problem policy dynamic really seems to be, there's a problem, Band-Aid. There's a problem, Band-Aid. So I think with Sigma coming through, it's been a really interesting to observe that the conversations have really been about how do we monitor, how do we measure, how do we even have the conversations across groups that I don't think really had any conversations before. The groundwaters, the orchard growers were kind of in their own thing, and the district managers with their heavy clay soil growing rice were kind of doing their own thing. And now has been almost like a forced pressure that you have to talk to each other and figure out some mutually agreeable ways to do it. But both of these restrictions have so far been grandfathered into the new laws, right? So there's been a tremendous anchoring effect of these two formulation of these two restrictions, right? 20% has become widely accepted, and the groundwater substitution restriction has also become widely accepted. And there's a lot of public support for the groundwater substitution restriction. So far, they've been grandfathered. If they're going to get tweaked, it's going to happen years eventually through the Groundwater Management Act conversations. I could speculate, but I won't. I think that conversation is beginning in the communities now.
Okay, I will go maybe where you didn't want to speculate. I think Sigma, yeah, it's very interesting because they're more precisely defining the groundwater rights and impacts,
yeah,
like they did for surface water. It seems like the place where the gains for trade are likely to be when you're looking at transfers within agriculture, as opposed to transfers to particularly cities where there are much bigger potential gains to be done, and severe crisis where all of a sudden it's a drought, it's an emergency, we need to do something different, which is, you know, where the original water banking came from. Those kind of opportunities to, you know, again, to think about, and in terms of being prepared for drought contingency planning, you know, somebody could help a district that was willing to, you know, work through the plans of, like you talk about, how to share the benefits, or, you know, what would it take to, you know, follow 40% if the circumstances arose and if the payoff was good enough.
Exactly. I mean, I'm going to speculate here. I think if the benefits were widely shared, this is a conversation to have. Okay, maybe in an extreme drought situation where it's been a 5th year of drought, fine, we'll go to 40% and then we will share. So one footnote that I don't think is in the paper, and I'm loving the fact that you guys are reading footnotes, because I'm a total footnote reader myself. One of the footnotes that I should put in as well is back in 91, 92 with the Big Bang moment of what I'm just nicknaming the Big Bang moment of water markets. One of the counties I know of, they put in, they said, we'll take 5% of the water sale price. The county, I mean, remember, the county is not the jurisdiction that is managing surface water transfers, but they were going to receive 5% of the water. So if it's $100 sale, which is actually a low price, the county gets $5 per acre foot as a blanket mitigation revenue. Maybe that 5% needs to be bigger. Maybe that 5% needs to go towards groundwater monitoring, groundwater, I mean, financing these GSAs, right? That would be a broader community benefit. And maybe in situations like that, there would be a tolerance or an appetite for going above 20% in certain cases.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Jess, you're up next.
Okay, great. Thanks. So my question, I'm not sure if my question is more of a reflection of maybe a misunderstanding on my part. So I apologize if that's the case. But from your initial sort of timeline, the 20% cap and the substitution requirement were implemented at the same time, yeah?
A little bit one after the other. The 20% restriction was a statewide restriction that was 92.
Uh-huh.
And the groundwater restriction was a local restrictions. Every county chose to do it. So not all counties did it. The
Okay.
county in which these districts, the sample districts are, it did it in 96. There were other counties who did it in 94. Another county did it in 93. But in this case study, 92, 96.
Okay. So, because it sounds to me like most of the conversation that we've been having and most of the conversation in the paper is about the extent to which the 20% cap is really the driver of the increased price, right? And that has really taken some potential purchasers out of the market, right? And limited the potential amount of transfers in that regard, right? And I guess one question I have is, how confident are you, or to what extent is there an interaction between the no transfer, or the secondary requirement, which I'm working on right now, that was implemented in 1996, right?
Wow.
And the 20% cap. In other words, right, I would be really curious, especially given that your 3 districts that you study have both of the restrictions. Do you have any sense of how those 2 restrictions interact? Under what conditions you might expect one to be more important in determining the total percent that ends up of the allocation that ends up being in the market, and those that relative to the total amount? So I guess my broader question is, to what extent are these 2 restraints complementary, potentially substitutional? How might they play out over different districts? Do you have any sense as to what, between 92 and 96, I can't recall what your graph actually showed, what happened before the second restraint was put into place, and how it might overall or sort of change your conclusions about attributing the cost increase to primarily the 20% restriction? If that is,
I think that's it's a really great point, and I think one of the things that you're saying, and you're actually saying a lot of interesting things. I think one of the things that you're saying is it possible that groundwater restriction is also playing a role in exacerbating that 20%? Yes, I need to process that, but I'll respond to several comments that you made. So 1996, right here, is the year when the groundwater restriction comes into place. Now notice that 1996 is the late 90s were a relatively wet period in California. So this is not a dry period. So there have been some analyses that have actually looked at whether the groundwater restriction dampened sales. The criticism I have of those studies is they were looking at the effect of groundwater restrictions in early 2000s. So of course their data was going to show that it did, but that dampening of sales could have been driven by the fact that those late 90s were a wet period. Fast forward to 2019 or 2021, right? Now we're looking at 2 decades almost, or 1.5, 2 decades since then. I think groundwater restriction has made sales completely fallow based. And on a side note, that's super fortunate for us as researchers, because remember, the satellite data can only see whether a piece of land is fallow or growing. It cannot tell us whether the growth was happening with groundwater or surface water. So when we started this, that was actually really fortunate, as a side note, that this when we observed that they're selling in, let's say, 2014, we can tell how much they're selling. There is no confusion. There is no groundwater pumping going on. right? So that was just a side note about just how measurement really works out because of this restriction.
Can I just clarify one, because that then suggests that we wouldn't know in the absence of the groundwater.
Exactly.
So we then don't know much about what is possible with just the cap.
Right. So if there was just the 20% cap, we actually might actually see that they were selling in 2010, but there was no fallow because they were pumping. Right? Exactly what you're thinking, right? So this approach works because of the groundwater restriction. Although that's not the question you asked, but it kind of came to me when you were asking your question. But yes, it's become completely fallow based. And because the price of rice also, because I've looked at that, I'm going to stop share so I can see faces. The price of rice has also gone up in recent years. And I didn't mention that, but that could also be a slight role because that's your opportunity cost of fallowing. That could also be pushing up the price of water. And especially some of those trade treaties with East Asia, because they're trying to open up the rice market, Japan's rice market to California rice, because a lot of rice that's grown here is sushi rice. If that opens up, that could actually increase the price of rice, and that might actually push the price of water in California. So that's another link there that I think is a little bit less recognized.
Right.
Does seem like a really cool
Oh,
opportunity.
sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say the final thing that I wanted to say, and then I'll be quiet. Which
No, just go ahead. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
oh, okay, just that it just seems like there's a really cool opportunity, depending on how much further you want to go with this project, right, to add a bunch of districts in there, because as you just described, there's potential feedbacks across these mechanisms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having some sense as to how, if you have these external shocks that may help us a little bit with some potential endogeneity problems or difficulty in separating these mechanisms, it seems like adding some of these districts in, and again, maybe you've already thought about this and made a conscientious decision not to do it, right?
No.
But it does seem like there's a lot more that could be going on, and you have this really useful capacity for measurement given this fallow dimension, right? But there's clearly a lot of stuff going on, and it would be fascinating to get a sense of the sort of the complex mechanisms surrounding how these two restrictions might interact, especially in the broader context of external shocks, the Japanese situation you just described, et cetera. So I'm gonna be quiet there. It just seems like there's so much potential here. So
I think, okay, yeah, I mean, I'm just going to respond briefly to you, to your comment, Jess. I think exactly, there's 29 years, 3 districts, that makes what, 90 data points. So I'm really tempted as an economist to throw as my advisor used to say, throwing atom bomb of econometrics on trailer park data. So I'm really pulling back from that, because I would really like to tell a story rather than just show off coefficients that were estimated with just 90 data points. But your instinct is absolutely right. These two restrictions are interacting in complex ways that are hard to tease apart in this small data set. I absolutely agree with you. And we did the land economics paper. We looked at all of these counties, not at the district level. We looked at the effect of groundwater restriction on land values. Just as a side note, we found that district lands that were in counties that restrict transfers lost money. There's a lot of money to be made by selling water. A lot of your land value could be coming from the hedonic opportunity of being able to sell water. So if you were in a county that passed a groundwater restriction like this, you lost some land value.
Yeah, I mean, the boomerang effect of having both the 92 and the 96 restrictions, if you didn't have the 96 restriction added on, you'd have had a more active water market. You might have had a more active water market, but you'd have had a worse groundwater overdraft problem.
Yes.
Because people would have kept growing and just pumped groundwater instead while they sold their surface water allocation. Anyway, Evan is up next. So Evan, it is your turn.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was curious about, you mentioned Sigma, and with Sigma coming online, probably going to have at least more demand for that surface water in order to maintain the storage in the groundwater basins. Do you think that, what are your thoughts with where the water market prices will go? And presumably these restrictions on fallowing are not related if they're within the county. You don't have that 20% restriction, right? That's only for outside of the district. So how are your measures going forward of how much land is fallowed, take into account how much water is being used to shore up the groundwater basin versus being sold to
Evan, what did you mean by the 20% restriction outside of the districts? I don't think I followed you there.
You mentioned 20% restrictions of sales. Is that fallowing total in the district? 20%, even if the water is being used to shore up the groundwater basin within the district?
Oh, okay.
That's it. I think we've lost Kelly here. Kelly was joined us for a little bit. She works for the county, and I sent her the flyer. This is the conversation that is happening now. That maybe these excess supplies could be used to bank locally. Because there's a lot of conversation going on about flood managed aquifer recharge. I think the county and these groundwater agencies are obviously very increasingly realizing that here's an opportunity to really maximize the value of this resource, because south of the Delta, Sigma is pretty much going to lead to taking, I forget the number, but the analysis showed it's going to be a significant area of agriculture that's just going to not be viable anymore. There is no definition of sustainability of groundwater, no matter how you define it. You just can't grow unless you can import water from somewhere. And there's a lot of conversation about buying from other areas, but there's just not that much supply if those basins are also going to be sustainable. So you're absolutely right. I agree that, or maybe both of us are wrong, but we agree that there's going to be a really high demand for this water going into the future. So the conversation that what I've understood is there's a lot of interest in using the excess supplies and banking those excess supplies, which, by the way, used to just flow out to the Delta. And see, that's the thing with water, right? There's always somebody who's not going to get that water. If you're going to bank it, even in a wet year, that was water that didn't go to the Delta. It didn't make it all the way to the ocean. So there are always environmental opportunity costs for local managed aquifer recharge. And there needs to be, I think they're talking about it at the state level, how to come up with best practices, but it's happening right now, that conversation.
And in responding to Evan's question, you said the D word in California water, which is Delta. So I have a real quick question about that. I'm going to sneak in ahead of time here, just a reminder to everybody. We will formally adjourn in about 5 minutes at the top of the hour. Professor Chaudhry has agreed to hang around on the Zoom link a little longer in case people want to stay on for additional questions. So before we get to the top of the hour, I just wanted to ask, clearly the epicenter of demand for water from the Sacramento Valley is in the San Joaquin Valley, as you said. But to get surplus water into the San Joaquin Valley, it basically has to come out of the Delta. Now, physically, water isn't like moved from, like if you sell a block of water, that block of water isn't physically moved from north to south. It's basically swapped out for supply. But I'm way out of my depth when I start talking Delta. It's the part of California water I understand the least. But
Same here.
there are conveyance restrictions on water coming out of the Delta too. And I wondered whether you have any feel for the extent to which this is also a constraint on the market. Because if I'm a Sacramento Valley irrigation district and I've got endless amounts of water, obviously I don't, but figuratively, hypothetically, if I had endless amounts of water to sell,
Mhm.
and my customers for that water are in the San Joaquin Valley, can they get it?
That's what they've been doing for the last, actually every sale they've made has been on the buyer has been in San Joaquin.
Right.
And sometimes the people in San Joaquin have been selling to LA. So it's a ripple.
Right.
Yeah, I mean the Delta, I mean again, Delta is, if they build the cross channels, then they can bypass the environmental restrictions in the Delta. But these districts, one of the reasons they're such attractive sources of supply is their water rights are so senior that a lot of other districts in the area that might have to go through additional reviews, in addition to the Delta reviews, they might have to go to additional reviews just at the district level before they can get to sell. But their water rights are so senior that overall in the transaction cost game, they have a cost advantage.
Sure.
But yes, in a super dry year, pumps out of the Delta, the federal rules are just too intense.
Yeah.
They do come into play.
Right. And those are the years, of course, when the San Joaquin Valley buyers would most want the water. So
Exactly.
that's
And
what I was wondering is whether that's also a choke point on the expansion of water marketing here. However, we have hit that point where we're going to formally adjourn. So I'm going to hand it to Scott to make any other announcements he wants to make, and then invite anybody who wishes to stay to stick around for a few minutes. But Scott, first to you.
Well, I have the happy duty of just thanking you again. And how about a round of applause? Because that was just brilliant. And thank you so much for agreeing to stick around as well, Anita. And then just as a quick reminder, we have that Roundtable Wednesday, but also just 2 more weeks of the colloque featuring Pranita next week, and then Harini. And Harini's talk on April 26th, that's also going to feature kind of a special presentation. So we're excited about that. But this was fantastic. I hope you can stick around for a few minutes to continue the conversation and enjoy the rest of your beautiful afternoons, at least those around Bloomington. This is ridiculous. So thanks again, Anita. And thank you, Bill.